Ladies and gentlemen, we're very fortunate to have with us here today Sir Richard Dearlove, who joined MI6 in 1966, rose to be its Director of Operations, as well as many other important roles, and then from 1999 to 2004 was the Chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, C, as he's called in your profession. I'd like to ask you some questions about your job and about the way in which you see the world from an intelligence perspective. But I'd like to start with the revelation in the Mail on Sunday today that states that at the Cliveden Literary Festival you're going to be telling us some more about this astonishing story about the recently deceased president of France, Jacques Chirac, and what might have been his motives in ensuring that France did not join the coalition of the willing in fighting Iraq in 2003. So could you add anything that was said to the Mail on Sunday report today, and also give us some background about the whole story?
Well, let me put it initially in context. Some of you will recall the phrase yellow cake. Yellow cake is the mined raw substance from which uranium is refined. And the yellow cake mines in Guinea are controlled by the French nuclear fuel company, Kojima. In the build-up to our concerns about Iraq and Iraq's rearmament, some very senior French officials came to London to talk to me. And they certainly agreed with our assessment that the Iraqis were in the process of attempting to resupply themselves, but clandestinely, not going through the international market, of course, with yellow cake from these mines. And this was a rather crucial and important piece of intelligence suggesting that the Iraqis were thinking of restarting their nuclear program. Several weeks after that visit, I got a call from an extremely senior French official saying, "Richard, would you please disregard what we told you? We do not want you to use the material, and we just really want you to put it to one side," which those of us who had participated in the talks was very peculiar indeed. Anyway, it subsequently became clear when the Iraqi situation evolved that the French were not keen on supporting a new UN resolution. So there were various countries on the Security Council who were moving in the direction of voting against a new UN resolution. So, I mean, that's the background and that's the context. And in parallel, we had indications, and bearing in mind historically that there had been a very close relationship over 15, 20 years between Iraq and France. And there were indications that Chirac had received funding from Hussein, both for the 1995 presidential election and the 2002 presidential election.
And by funding, you mean underhand cash and large
cash
amounts
in a briefcase, basically.
Handed over to...
Well, I mean, I can't say, I'm not going to give you full details. I'm going to say there were clear indications, and certainly both the Americans and ourselves shared the same point of view. And we were therefore suspicious, let's put it like that, of what Chirac's motives were. Now, his obituaries have just been written, and I admire him significantly as a French politician, but the standards in French politics in the 80s, I think, were rather different from those that may pertain.
So you admire him
now.
as a very corrupt French politician?
He was a rogue. Well, let's say he had roguish characteristics.
Yes.
But there are quite a number of stories in the public domain, and I mean, some of you will recall that he ended up in court. Once his presidential immunity had been withdrawn, he actually ended up in court for the time that he'd been mayor of Paris because of the way that he exercised his patronage during that period of time. So I I mean, he has a pretty murky and complex past in the way that, other European politicians maybe don't have those sort of shadows and shades. I mean, if you look at Mitterrand's past, I'm not going to get into discussing Mitterrand. And, I spent a lot of my career in France doing French things, being very close to the French services with whom I've liaised extensively. Yeah. And I'm a very great admirer of them. But I think you just have to understand what the realities of French politics are.
Right. We're going to move on now, but if anybody wants to ask a question, more detailed question about this revelation, that we can do that during the Q&A system. 1966 you started in the service. How was it different today? What was it like being a spy back in 1966?
Spy master. It's a subtle distinction. Well, I joined the service by accident. In those days, you wouldn't have had a deliberate plan to join SIS. I was also 21, so I was, I think, 3 years under the minimum age of joining. So I'm not quite sure why.
So straight down from Cambridge? Straight down from Cambridge,
straight into the service. My first 2 years in SIS, I worked in counterintelligence, but I was very confused because it was really difficult to understand what was happening inside SIS because no one would really talk about it. Of course, what was happening, because everything was so heavily compartmented, was that the service was in the process of recovering from the penetration, particularly of Philby, although that had happened quite a long time before. But Philby did a runner from the Middle East, as you all know, in 1963, I think. And similarly, George Blake, who had been recruited in a Korean prisoner of war camp and done huge damage to the service in terms of its Cold War operations, had been convicted and gone to prison. So the service was sort of divided between those who believed that we had the ability over time to even the score with the Soviet Union and its Warsaw Pact allies, and those who were totally infected with what I would describe as a counterintelligence virus.
You've actually called it nihilism.
Well, I called it nihilism, yeah, because what had happened was that there were a number of sort of semi-important Soviet defectors around that time who painted a picture that the Soviet Union had every Western intelligence service at its mercy. And the CI practitioners had reached a mental situation where they said, look,
CI being counterintelligence.
Everything we're doing is pointless. And probably all these wonderful operations we're running are under control. So what's the point? And they were very, very destructive, very sort of corrosive.
And you think James Jesus Angleton was
Well, there was this famous character in CIA who had the extraordinary name James Jesus Angleton, whom you can read a lot about. And he was the sort of arch high priest of the CI nihilists and had his devoted followers both in MI6 and in MI5. But what actually was happening, I mean, this gives you a good example of the damage of penetration. The damage of penetration isn't necessarily the information you lose, it's the psychological consequence of being penetrated. But there were a cadre of officers inside MI6 led by a very brilliant, probably one of the great Western intelligence officers. An American academic is about to write a book about him because nothing's known about this man, or he had no obituaries. And he had a cohort.
Remind us his name.
He was called Harvey Shergold, generally known in the intelligence community as Shergy. And he was rather exotic. He was a little piercing, blue eyes, very small. He was the son of an artist, and he was born on the Giudecca in Venice, rather romantic.
Really?
And he was a formidable intelligence officer. And he and a cohort of other officers were busy building significant success against the Soviet Union and its allies. And of course, the case that you will probably all have heard of and know about, which really made his reputation, but it wasn't the only case, was the Penkovsky case, which was the penetration of the Soviet General Staff at a very high level. And it was Penkovsky who produced thousands of documents and materials, and he was run by a team of SIS officers and then partly run clandestinely in Moscow. Interestingly, the contacts were done by the wife of the head of station, and the capsules of film were dropped into the baby's pram in the park. I mean, it was
story.
Classic high espionage. But I mean, it's an incredibly important case, and it allowed Kennedy to face down Khrushchev during the Cuba crisis. So, I mean, what Shergi did was really rebuild the service's confidence and reputation. And he had this extraordinary group, and I think it's worth mentioning, really, to pay tribute to these people. Most of his immediate cohort of helpers were maiden ladies of a certain age. They were all incredibly clever, incredibly self-disciplined, with formidable memories. There was a little, I mean, I shouldn't say this now, but I mean, the sort of image of a little lady sitting in an office. And if you wanted to know anything about the Polish intelligence service, which was an important service, by the way, and she had about 5,000 cards in her office, because this was before IT. So you go into her office and mention a name to her. Yes, I've got a card in this character. And pretty much be able to tell you the content of the card without reading it.
Yeah.
And these people were absolutely central to the success of the operations that Shergi directed and ran. And I was basically, what I understood after 3 years in the service, that I had been recruited to be part of that team. And after a posting in Africa, I went behind the Iron Curtain. I went to Prague. And
where you learned Czech?
I learned Czech before I went, so I could speak reasonably fluent Czech. Well, no, pretty fluent Czech. Which is not the sort of language that you would bother to learn every day of the week. And I can actually mention it now because it's been researched and publicized by Czech academics, and there isn't a book about it. There's extensive writing about the case. We had a very important penetration of the Czechoslovak intelligence service at a very senior level. So the officer who was in charge of all the operations against the United Kingdom was actually a British agent. Wow. So my job was to run that case. And I ran the case until this extraordinary individual actually died, probably because of the stress he was under of a heart attack. And therefore, we lost that access. But I mean, it's a very good example of what being on the front line of the Cold War was like. And there's a person sitting in this room who assisted me greatly in going to the contacts and doing the counter-surveillance. And
I'm looking around now.
it's my wife.
No, absolutely.
Who was trained also to assist me because the stakes in these cases were so high.
Wonderful. Thank you, Rosalind Dearlove. The lady, the mention of the lady who knows all about the Polish intelligence service is, of course, reminiscent of Le Carré. And it's impossible to talk about SIS without mentioning Ian Fleming, Le Carré, Le Quex, and then more recently, of course, Alan Judd and other writers in this sphere, and then, of course, Christopher Andrew as a serious and substantial historian of MI6. How much is the sort of myth, as you call it in your Hinsley Memorial Lecture, the myth of MI6 bound up with all of these authors? To what extent is it helpful? To what extent is it a problem?
It's a problem and it's helpful. I mean, I think the myth is important, and ironically in the UK, the myth tends to be propagated through fiction. And the reason the myth is important is if you take something completely detached from reality like Bond, it is a global franchise. So it's a series of thrillers which reach probably, a billion,
Absolutely.
a seventh of the world's population. So this creates a reputation and a myth, which, of course, in the case of that character is totally misleading. But the myth is important because a lot of the best intelligence cases are what we call walk-ins or offers of service. And they come to the service that they know about and find you rather than you going to find them. So the myth is crucial. The two mythologists primarily are, unfortunately, Bond. And of course, I'll tell you a little anecdote about the Bond films. The first Bond film in which the MI6 building appears.
The new one in Vauxhall Cross.
Yeah, it was made when Robin Cook was Foreign Secretary and I was Chief. And knowing that I would say no, Robin didn't ask me when he was approached by the film company to say, well, do you mind if we use the building as a backdrop?
Yeah. You were going to say no. He said yes.
He said yes, and that's why it appears in the film.
It gets blown to pieces.
It gets blown to pieces. Fortunately, it gets blown to pieces. That was a rather elaborate model they made in which to do it. But of course, the other myth maker is Le Carré, and we've all enjoyed enormously reading the Smiley books in particular. I don't like his later novels, but the Smiley books have a certain quality. And he does capture something of the essence of what it was like in the Cold War. However, he is so corrosive in his view of MI6 that most professional SIS officers are pretty angry with him. Let me explain in a little more detail why. He flips the coin of reality. What I mean by that is that intelligence organizations are based on trust between colleagues. That's how they operate. Trust between case officers and agents, trust between colleagues, the keeping of great secrets. His books are exclusively about betrayal. He writes in the tradition of the CI, the counterintelligence nihilists. He's their sort of literary representative.
Yeah.
And it's only when you dig deeply into the books that you realize. But of course, he would turn around and say, well, writing about honourable men makes lousy novels.
Yes. But what did you do to annoy him in the service when he was there?
Well, actually, I really don't know. It's interesting. I did buy this memoir that he wrote. It's not his memoirs, a thing called Pigeon Tunnel.
Yeah.
And if you read Pigeon Tunnel, he's obsessed with his membership of SIS. He was only in the service, I think, for 3 years. And something must have happened to him whilst he was there to sort of breed this cynicism. But I rather resent the fact that, he's traded on his knowledge and his reputation. And yet, I think the feeling I get is he really intensely dislikes the service and
Absolutely.
what it represents.
I once asked somebody who's in your old service whether or not they used phrases from Le Carré like dead letter drop and Moscow circus and so on. And this chap told me, well, we didn't until the Smiley novels. And now we do all the time.
But the best, it's another plug, not for you this time.
Yeah.
The best contemporary spy writer is Alan Judd.
Yes, absolutely.
In
Alan
terms
Judd,
of Judd,
is the
J-U-D-D.
Right, brilliant spy.
And if you read Alan's books, you get a really authentic, I think, picture of what it might be like to work inside the service. And it's quite funny because he snipped up the DNA of people he knows and rejoined it to make different people.
Yes.
So you turn over, I know this guy. And then, no, well, maybe that's somebody else. But I recommend them. They're good reads, and they are sort of seriously focused around contemporary issues. They're clever. The latest one he's written, very controversially, and I'm not going to answer any questions specifically about that. It's about Brexit.
Right. Aren't you?
Well, I can, but...
later on.
No.
What about Stella Rimington, former head of MI5?
Well, Stella's a greatly admired colleague. we did a lot together operationally before she became head of service. But she was extremely badly behaved. She wrote a book which had to be authorized. I mean, you can't imagine the government taking the former Director General of Security Service to court to stop publication of a book. So she produced a book which made a lot of her colleagues, both in MI5 and MI6, extremely angry because they felt that she just shouldn't have written it. Now, since that book and others have come out, staff joining the intelligence community have to sign away their copyright. They not only sign the Official Secrets Act, they sign away the copyright. So you can't, well, you can write a book about your experiences if you wish. You're not going to make any money out of it. It's been tested in the courts. There was already a case where the service recuperated all the money of an illicit book written by a former member of SIS.
Moving from fiction on to fact, you were C at the time of 9/11. Talk us through what that was like.
Rosalind and I, my wife and I, were on a plane flying back from Stockholm. We've been on an official visit to Stockholm. We land at London Airport, and strangely, I look out of the plane and see that my armoured BMW is sitting on the tarmac. Now, in the UK, we don't do things like send cars out to the plane to pick up passengers. You go out through immigration like any other person and collect your car as anybody would. So I was really shocked to see my car. So, of course, when I get down the bottom of the side gangway out of the aircraft, I'm told what's happened and driven straight to 10 Downing Street, dropping off my wife on the way. Within 36 hours, I was at Lynham, RAF Lynham, on Blair's instructions with, well, the only plane available was a Lockheed TriStar transport aircraft. It's like flying in a squash court. So they rapidly strapped a row of seats into the back of this plane. And I think myself, I think Eliza Manningham-Buller was there, someone from GCHQ and my private secretary. We were off, but US airspace was closed. So the commander of the Air Force base at Lynham said, you can't take off because you haven't got clearance to enter US airspace. And I said, well, I'm reasonably confident that by the time we get halfway across the Atlantic, the president will have agreed.
Not to shoot you down.
Not to shoot us down. Well, that's exactly. So we did take off with a heavy load of fuel to make sure we could fly back if we didn't get clearance. And we were intercepted by 3 F-14 fighter planes when we got nearer to the US. And actually, we flew down over the Twin Towers. It was extremely moving and extraordinary event. Landed at Edwards Air Force Base just outside Washington, and then were taken straight to CIA headquarters. And I mean, all I can say is that the US were in a state of significant shock. And then I spent, I think, 4 or 5 days going around seeing senior members of the US intelligence community, I think meeting the president at the time, and really pledging British support to the US in response to this extraordinary attack. I mean, we had had an intelligence summit in Bermuda. It was under the British flag, so we organized it in Bermuda because it wasn't very far from Washington. And the senior cohorts of FBI and CIA had flown down to meet us, and this was in June. And we knew from the noise, not from specific human, but from the noise.
And by noise, you mean chatter on...
Chatter on intercept and chatter that something big was being planned. We didn't know where, we didn't know when, we didn't know what the target was. But I mean, the extraordinary thing about 9/11, and people forget this, and I mean, it riles me every time I think about it, is when, do you remember the blind sheikh, Ramzi Yusuf?
Yeah.
Ramzi Yousef was in charge of this terrorist team that planted the bomb under the Twin Towers in the car park.
In 93.
In 93. And they put in the wrong place. Now, the idea was to blow up the car park and collapse one tower into the other tower. I had been to be briefed by the SAC, the special agent in charge in New York after this attack, and came back to the UK, and we had a seminar with the chiefs of staff and all the heads of the intelligence and security services in the UK. And at that time, David Spedding was chief, but he was ill, so I chaired the meeting. And I said, my opening sentences in the meeting, I've just come back from New York, I want you all to imagine what we would now be saying and doing if the Twin Tower bomb had been successful. And what I'm saying is that we had a clue to the target in 93. So when the inquiry, the US inquiry into 9/11 said, it wasn't a failure of intelligence, it was a failure of imagination. It's quite a good way of, I think, stating what happened. And, 9/11 was a defining line, for intelligence personnel at the time. There was a before, there was an after. And, it was a little bit like the French Revolution, to take a historical, a line in the sand. And, it did at that moment in time change pretty much. It changed the government's attitude towards financing the intelligence and security community. I went to see, when I got back, I went to see Gordon Brown, who was Chancellor at the time, and he said to me, well, how much extra money do you need, Richard, to start with? Because which infuriates the Treasury, because you know how budgeting works in government. You go through these 3-year cycles and committees and arguments. And I remember sitting there in Gordon's office, I think if you start off with 50 million, that'd be great.
Fantastic. At what stage did you start thinking of Iraq as being as being an enemy needing to be attacked?
Well, bear in mind that after the first Gulf War, we were in a situation of enmity with Iraq, and we were containing Iraq. And if you recall the details, we had RAF fighter jets flying out of Incirlik in Turkey, denying movement of the Iraqi military north of the 34th parallel, or whatever it was. So, there was already a sort of nascent military standoff. And, the problem with Iraq during this period is that the containment of Iraq was falling apart. So the policy of containment wasn't working, and the oil for food program in particular wasn't working. These are, as it were, the circumstances, and then there's this trickle of intelligence that starts coming, which indicates to us that certainly Iraq is rearming. I say certainly is rearming. Now, this is quite controversial, but if you've got the time, well, if you read the Chilcot report, it took 8 years to produce, 12 volumes, longer than the Bible. It still doesn't even answer, in my view, some of the key questions. And if you want a very simple statement about why Iraq went so wrong, I think there is one thing which I'm really disappointed isn't in the Chilcot report clearly. The idea that we didn't have sources of intelligence is rubbish. We did. And that's, I think, clear if you read the documentation carefully. But Saddam was a terrifying leader who killed people who disagreed with him or contradicted him. And the people we were talking to, I think, were telling Saddam that the rearmament was much more advanced than it actually was. So our sources themselves were telling stuff, Saddam stuff, which wasn't entirely accurate. They weren't that far down the track. And of course, the other thing that the Iraqis were desperate to do at the time was to deceive Iran and to make sure that the Iranians didn't understand their weakness. And forget about the dodgy dossier, all this stuff. It's a much, much more complex issue than has been historically presented. And I think it will take, the distance of history for people to sit down and really understand what happened. Okay, some of the intelligence was definitely wrong. Surprising amount of it, I think, was correct. And I still believe that we've not got to the bottom of that. And there are certain areas where I'm almost sure in my own mind, and there's some interesting photographic evidence of this, that quite a bit of stuff at the last moment went over in flatbed convoys covered in canvas into Syria. And of course, no one asked the question, well, okay, why we get so worried about Syrian chemical weapons, when that became an issue in Syria. So it's still opaque, and there's still stuff that will need to be explained.
Tell us about Libya and your work trying to denuclearize Colonel Gaddafi.
Yeah, well, that was extraordinary. I can't remember the exact timing, but it's after Iraq. Mm. I receive a message through an intermediary that Libya wishes to disarm itself of its so-called WMD. I mean, we have to be careful with the use of this term, but let's use it for shorthand. Another interlocutor comes to see me to say this is a genuine offer. That's pretty striking and surprising development. But we do know at this period of time that Libya has purchased from the Pakistanis, from A.Q. Khan, the technology to start its own nuclear weapons program. And we have chapter and verse and detail on this. I have just traveled around European, actually heads of government in some case, to tell them secretly that we believe Gaddafi is starting a nuclear weapons program. And if you put those circles around Libya for the range of their missiles, it actually puts a lot of European capitals within the range of Libya. I'm told by my European interlocutors, I think you're mistaken, Richard. I said, well, I can assure you we're not. So if you wish to see the material, we will arrange for you to see it in detail. So with another of my senior officers, I go to see the Prime Minister, and I say, well, we've got this offer. And he says, well, Richard, what do you think we should do? And I say, well, we've had indications that it really is a genuine offer. I think you should send me or someone to Libya. So that's exactly what happened. We climb on an unmarked plane and we fly off to what used to be the American Air Force Base in Tripoli, Wheelus. So we land at Wheelus Air Force Base, nobody there.
No one at all?
No. So we park the plane.
Okay. What do you do next?
Well, eventually 2 guys in jeans turn up. Right. So we open the door of the plane and say, hi, No, literally, we say, hi, we're here to see Gaddafi.
They say, pull the other one.
No, and they say, he's not here, he's down in Sirte. So we say, fine, we were told to come to Wheelus Air Force Base. And they've given the plane clearance and we've landed, but it's all pretty disconcerting. So we say, well, look, we think the best thing is if you come with us. So we stick them on our plane and we fly off to Sirte. We land at Sirte, and sure enough, when we land at Sirte, there are 3 large black Mercedes parked on the tarmac. And we climb into the black Mercedes and are driven off into the desert. I mean, we haven't got a clue where we're going or anything. It's high drama. I've got a very experienced SIS officer with me who's a brilliant Arabist, speaks fluent Arabic. And we're shown into a tent in the desert, about the size of this tent here. Right. And there's a little sofa in the corner. And we sit there. And I mean, if any of you have any experience in the Middle East, you know that if you're seeing Middle East potentates, the first thing they do is make you wait. And they really make you wait a long time. And, it's been a warm day, so we're in lightweight suits. But by this time, it's like 8, 9, 10 o'clock at night. And it's getting very, very cold in the desert. And eventually, in walks Gaddafi, with a camel blanket on and a little pillbox hat and his hair. He looks a bit like Mick Jagger. He does. But it's clear when we sit down to talk to him that talking to him is you've got to sit and listen to him. And we sit there and listen to him for about 2 hours. This is a monologue that goes on and on and on and on and on. And okay, my friend's interpreting, we've got another interpreter there. And eventually, after this long diatribe about the state of the world in the Middle East and his view of what should be done, I say to him, we're here to arrange the arrangements of your disarmament. It was pretty much as blunt as that. And then I said, but the message I convey from the British and American governments is no deal unless the nuclear's involved. So he said, well, I haven't got a nuclear program. I mean, he replies in his Arabic. And I said, well, you have. And, we know about it. And I will reiterate, absolutely no deal unless that's included. And, eventually, we go back to Sirte. It's now in the early hours of the morning, fly back to Tripoli. That night, end up in a weird hotel in Tripoli. And then back to the UK. And then really quite rapidly things evolve because his head of intelligence, Musa Kusa, comes to London. The negotiations continue in London. And then a team of US and British inspectors do go down to, remove this stuff. And I'm pleased to say that of the 24 nuclear sites that research laboratories and stuff like that they visit, they're all exactly what we thought they were, with the exception of one, which we discover is a chicken farm.
Right. And the happy ending to that is that his nuclear program now is in a museum in Tennessee.
Correct.
Which happily ever after. A couple more questions before I throw this open to the audience. The first is that about a year ago, in one of his speeches, Jeremy Corbyn suggested that a future Labour government might abolish both MI5 and MI6. What are your thoughts on that?
Well,
yeah, I know, I agree.
No, I'll just say one thing. I think the realities of power, the moment you get into power, you see things differently. Even Jeremy Corbyn might see things differently the moment he gets into power. And interestingly, if you look at the relationship between governments and the intelligence community, the relationship traditionally with Labour governments has been extremely close, extremely fruitful, and they have been, very, very firm supporters. The first thing you have to do as chief is go and brief either the Foreign Secretary or the Prime Minister to make sure they understand what political risks they're carrying. And Robin Cook was lovely. I really liked him. He was bloody difficult, but he was hyper intelligent. He was very amusing and witty and a clever man. And I went to brief him, and he looked at me and said, "Richard, nobody warned me." And he turned out to be a very supportive Foreign Secretary. And he was good because he had clear views. So you always knew where he stood on an issue. And although he drove lots of people spare, I really did like him, and he became a pretty good friend.
You were in the audience, I think, earlier with when David Petraeus said that Putin was the best thing ever to happen to NATO. Would you go along with that? What's your
I
assessment?
absolutely agree with that. I mean, I think at the end of the Cold War, during the period when you probably, discussion of the peace dividend, whether we needed big armed forces or we needed a security and intelligence community, and questions about, whether NATO should survive as a viable alliance. But, and I think it's raison d'etre. In the period when it looked as though we might have a different relationship with Russia, which never materialized, you could ask that question, should NATO continue? But the enthusiasm for NATO, the consolidation of the command structure, the modernization of its weapons programs, issues like interoperability, I mean, they've massively moved forward. And I mean, the fact is, we're not going to fight a conventional war with Russia. We're not going to fight a war with Russia. But, the deterrent effect of NATO, the overwhelming military force of NATO, including the Americans. And I mean, I think Trump has done one thing correctly, which is to call out the Germans. I mean, the Germans owe far more money to NATO than we ever owe to the EU. The 39 billion that we're meant to pay under the withdrawal agreement to leave the EU. The Germans owe NATO massively more than that. Okay, we constrained, for obvious reasons, their armament program post-World War II, but that's over now. The reinforcement of NATO has been a very positive and important development.
You mentioned the Germans, which segs slightly into the Brexit question. Yeah. Do you think that that SIS would be significantly worse off under Brexit? I don't mean obviously financially worse off. I mean with regard to its capacities.
Well, I've spoken out about this pretty loudly, and my views are well known.
Which is why I'm asking.
Yeah, okay. But the UK's policy towards Brussels has been to absolutely make sure that Brussels has no significant foot in national security. So, for example, when a European constitution was drafted, which never passed, if you remember, but it got pretty close to passing, I was sent round Europe to each European government to get the French, not the Germans. The Germans were not keen on this, the Italians, the Spanish, to agree to cross out every reference to national security which was in the constitutional document, which we did have excised. And I mean, the fact is that we have made sure in the UK that Brussels has no operational or executive power on anything to do with defence and security. It's been British policy. It's unstated British policy. And in fact, the UK is Europe's intelligence, I wasn't going to say superpower, but main power. The French are the others, but I don't think that they are at our level. So we have important bilateral relationships with every EU member state. And there are intelligence clubs, which people meet, but nothing sensitive is ever, as it were, exchanged on a club basis, because you can't, if you have sensitive intelligence on, a forthcoming terrorist threat, you're not going to distribute it to 26 other nations because it'll leak for sure. Especially, you've got to deal with the whole idea of Soviet penetration of former communist countries in Central Europe, where the Russians are still very active. So everything is done on a bilateral exchange. And I mean, there are one or two areas where there's EU legislation that controls certain exchanges, like certain data things, advanced passenger lists for flying. But and there would be a slight loss there. But that can be replicated in bilateral agreements, particularly as most European nations are the demandeurs of us rather than the other way around. They're all desperate for this relationship with the UK to continue. So when Cameron got up and said, look, this is going to damage our security. Well, maybe in a geopolitical sense there's damage, but in terms of an operational day-to-day sense, I mean, frankly, it makes no difference.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, there are two travelling mics there. If you've got something you'd like to ask Sir Richard, please put up your hand. There's a lady here.
There are indiscreet answers to indiscreet questions, if you see what I mean. So if I care not to answer it, you'll just have to bear with me.
Madam.
My question has to do with President Trump and his, shall we say, distrust of intelligence agencies, his actual demonization of the intelligence community in the United States, and the fact that he personally has either leaked or perhaps compromised intelligence assets around the world. What do you think the consequences of that are for the United States and for the EU?
Well, I think, I'm a commentator. I have no inside information on Trump other than what you have. I do sort of talk to friends in the States, and I think, in a way, this is almost schizophrenic. Trump, the politician, I mean, when does Trump the politician not behave as Trump the president, I mean, they are confused. And, I mean, he does behave in a way which is quite irresponsible towards aspects of the intelligence community. And, in fact, you may recall during the presidential campaign, unprecedented, the head of GCHQ actually issued a denial about the UK not doing certain things which Trump implied that they might have done. And that's a huge departure from policy, because in the UK it's neither confirm nor deny. And that's a really good line for us to take. So you don't say yes or no, you just say nothing. So, yeah, living with Trump is, I think, extremely difficult and challenging, particularly for our American colleagues, because of his unpredictability and what they would see as a lack of security discipline in the way that he does certain things. All I would say is that I know from, and I'm sure that General Petraeus would agree with me, the actual relationship on the ground between us and our American allies remains extremely close, extremely productive, extremely important, and, is one of the foundations of Western security policy. It's a very equivocal situation.
Next question, yes, at the back there, gentlemen.
On Iraq, do you feel that you were sort of led up the garden path a bit by Blair and Brown when you sat on the sofa with them and were sort of able to give some sort of credence to this 25-minute hit on the UK from Hussein when, was it Chirac said, and you talked about yellow cake earlier, when Chirac said it was never going to happen?
Well, this is all benefit of hindsight stuff. And at the time, I would say it looked rather different. Led up the garden path? No. Some of the intelligence was right, some of it was wrong. But let me make a point about the Iraqi decision to go to, to invade Iraq. A decision like that is based on a combination of, policy insights, open intelligence. And in a normal situation, when you're taking a difficult policy decision, it's probably 80% overt information that governs your decision-taking. With the benefit of hindsight now, I would say that the problem with Iraq is that when it came to persuading Parliament to vote in favour of the invasion, 100% of the decision weight on the policy was placed on the intelligence. So, as it were, the intelligence beam had too much weight on it and it buckled. And that was a very unusual situation to be in. And, it's occasionally replicated. I mean, let's take another. I mentioned the Cuba crisis. The Cuba crisis was based almost 100% on overhead supported by Penkovsky's intelligence. It didn't buckle. In fact, it took the world to the brink of a nuclear war, and it saved our skin. Fortunately, the consequences of the Iraq decision were very serious for thousands of people but it wasn't the start of a global war. And I would still argue that a lot of the intelligence was correct, and the initial conclusions that we reached about starting to rearm, I would still stand by. And actually, any of you probably, I bet none of you in the room have read the Dolfer report. The Dolfer report is the final inspection report that was produced from Iraq. It's several thousand pages in length. It's got lots of interesting material in it, which is just dismissed now because there is a trope about Iraq which people subscribe to without understanding the complexity. I think history, maybe brilliant historians like Andrew one day will sit down and forensically look at this material and come to a more balanced view of what happened.
Well, as an historian, I'm very much in favour of the benefit of hindsight. This lady here.
Are there any circumstances when agents of intelligence agencies are allowed to act above the law prescribed for common citizens of respect?
I think the answer to that is no. Well, it's a complicated question. Look, hang on a moment. The Intelligence Services Act, which, as it were, created the avowal, which was the government's formal admission that it had an intelligence service, renders legal the activities of British intelligence in British jurisdiction. So it covers the principle of what's called extraterritoriality. So as long as you have done what the Act tells you to in terms of political approval, you have the right signatures, what you do as a service in the UK, you cannot be prosecuted in any British jurisdiction or British-controlled jurisdiction. But what SIS is doing overseas is probably illegal in the country in which it's operating in terms of encouraging, let's say, in a hostile country, encouraging one of their nationals to spy for Britain. So it observes absolutely to the letter the common law in the UK. And actually, if you read the Intelligence Services Act, which is an extraordinary document, it's a piece of brilliant and very elegant legislation. Because if you think about legislating for an intelligence community, it could be pages, it's 1.5 pages long. And it's exactly, conceptually, what it should be. And actually, there's an interesting legal point. When the Corruption Act was passed in the UK, which makes it, illegal to suborn a foreign official, someone forgot that we had an intelligence community.
Gentleman over there.
Hello. Just a one-word yes or no. I wasn't sure whether the previous question was whether enhanced interrogation techniques are ever justifiable. So just a yes or no would be helpful. And if I may, I've just got another question.
Well, they're not justifiable.
Okay,
the law
thank
should
you.
be observed fundamentally in terms of interrogation. There's absolutely no equivocation about that whatsoever.
Thank you. My real question is, it was really interesting hearing you talk about Libya and Colonel Gaddafi's program of nuclear weapons. Is it inevitable that rogue states will develop nuclear weapons, and what do you think we should do about that?
It's certainly not inevitable because you need a sophisticated industrial base. You also need the technology, and you need to be able to either go down the uranium route. Well, there are two or three routes, and they're all quite complicated. The worry is that a country like Pakistan has sold or could sell its technology. And the Pakistani example is quite extraordinary. And in fact, the whole concept of proliferation is based on the Pakistani program. And a very brilliant, now deceased MI6 officer, who I cannot name, sat down with a cold towel on his head in a darkened room and analysed globally the PhDs being done by every Pakistani student in a foreign university. And that material had been assembled. And he worked out, from looking at the PhD subjects, my God, they're building a nuclear weapon. And of course, he was exactly right. And A.Q. Khan, who is the father of the Pakistani bomb, a very brilliant scientist in his own right with his team, he did sell this stuff to Libya for cash.
And North Korea as well? Was he involved in North Korea?
The North Korean program, yes, is also derived from the Pakistani program. So the two other ones that we know about are directly Pakistani derived and use that technology. And there's a complicated story here. Is Gordon Carreras in the art? He's written a book about it. But there was this extraordinary Swiss family of engineers called the Tinners, who had cracked the technology of building centrifuges to produce highly enriched uranium. And I mean, the Tinners set up secret factories around the world that made this bit of a centrifuge and that bit of it. So no one in the network actually knew precisely what they were making. They were just making high precision engineering parts. And part of the big achievement, I mean, this needs to be sort of better publicized and understood, because it isn't just the war in Iraq and the disarmament of Libya. The whole of that nuclear network, which could have seeded other nuclear programs, was dismantled as a consequence of these events around the Iraq war, around the problems in Libya. And at the time, this was incredibly important because globally, there was no clear initiative to slow down and stop nuclear proliferation. And it still is, a major problem, but I'm no longer in the know, so I can't tell you more than I know historically.
Another question, this gentleman here in the middle. Thanks.
Thank you. Whilst recognising hindsight is a wonderful thing, I was interested in your answer to the gentleman over here. If we cast our minds back to the time when the invasion of Iraq happened, we can recall the kind of media frenzy that was abounding at the time. We recall the Americans utilised the power and persuasiveness of Tony Blair in their own government to persuade themselves this was a good thing to do because we had this support of the UK. So my question is, the sort of danger I see of what you've said there, that we acted on the best information we had available at the time, is that doesn't give me the confidence in the same circumstances we wouldn't do the same thing again and lead to the same sort of catastrophe that's ensued subsequently. So are there any other learnings that you think that we can take from what happened?
I mean, each crisis teaches you more about your own shortcomings, and you hope you handle the next one better. I mean, I think the main problem in Iraq, it's interesting, General Petraeus referred to this. Iraq, I think, would have turned out differently in terms of the immediate aftermath of the military engagement if the Iraqi military and the Ba'ath Party structures had not been dissolved by Bremer. The UK was not consulted on that issue. And my advice to Blair, which he didn't follow, because I'm not a policy guy, but I said, look, what we should have, because bits of the Iraqi army were not particularly contaminated by Saddam Hussein. So there was the army out here, there was the Republican Guard here, and there was the Special Republican Guard here. But the military was a pretty traditional Arab military. And many of us thought that we could have run the country with the Ba'ath Party structures intact and with the Iraqi military intact. So appointed a military council, run the country for 3 or 4 years until it stabilized, and then moved to elections, rather than taking this rapid ideological step. And of course, what happened was the military went home with their weapons. And, I mean, ISIS that we subsequently had to fight as a military force, a lot of that were former Baathists and former Iraqi soldiers. So, I mean, it really was a disaster. Remember being in Blair's office the morning we learnt this. And I mean, some of us were in despair. And that was day one before things went wrong.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Spy Master.